Redditor 1. I had never before recounted every detail of what transpired at my grandfather's winter wedding. Not out of reluctance, but because I'd long convinced myself it was simply one of those mountain legends from northern Iraq. You know, the kind of tale that's shared over steaming cups of chai when snow presses against mud brick walls and the wind roars like a famished wolf down narrow village lanes. Yet I can no longer pretend, not after the discovery I made last week in my grandmother's cedar chest. The wedding occurred in either 1939 or 1940. Back then, in our village, the season mattered far more than exact dates. It was the heart of winter, mountains cloaked in thick snow and a sun that vanished by mid-afternoon. We called it wedding season, a brief period when families gathered in the scant daylight to celebrate new beginnings. I was 12 and had been given the task of helping my aunt prepare the reception hall. Inside, the air was redolent with cardamom and wood smoke, and warm bodies pressed together against the bitter cold outside. The chill was so severe that even the sheep had been ushered indoors, their bleats mingling with the high-pitched ululations of women and the deep, hearty laughter of men. Hamid, the wedding singer, arrived shortly after sunset. I remember him clearly, a tall man with deep-set eyes and tobacco-stained fingers that glided over his oud strings as if spinning silk. His voice stirred tears in women and evoked memories in the elderly. That night, he donned a heavy wool coat over his traditional garb, and his breath appeared in white puffs as he shook the snow from his boots. The celebration unfolded in its usual manner. Men congregated on one side and women on the other, although as the night deepened, the separation faded. My grandfather, the groom, presided at the head table with his newlywed bride, her face hidden by a veil and silent by his side. Platters of rice and lamb were passed among the guests, while Hamid's voice soared above the din, singing age-old ballads of love that had echoed across these mountains for generations. It was just after 9 when Hamid excused himself to answer nature's call. In those days, without indoor plumbing, such calls meant trudging through the snow to a designated spot behind the reception hall. "Just a few minutes," he said, setting his oud aside. "Keep the drums playing until I'm back." My uncle Hassan, who had been watching Hamid with an unusual intensity all evening, leaned toward me. "Follow him," he whispered. "Make sure he doesn't get lost in the storm." In our culture, children never questioned their elders, so I obeyed without hesitation. I grabbed my heavy coat and trailed after Hamid. The night was strangely bright. The full moon transformed the snowy landscape into an alien, almost enchanted vista. His footprints etched dark trails in the pristine snow. Keeping a safe distance so as not to be noticed, I followed him under the guise of duty while indulging my youthful curiosity. The wind carried his voice back, though it was no longer singing, it was conversing with someone, his words swallowed by the gusts, swirling between buildings. I edged closer, pressing against the rough stone wall of the reception hall, and heard him murmur, "How far? That's impossible." Then I saw them. They flanked Hamid, tall, shadowy figures that seemed to absorb the moonlight instead of reflecting it. Their movements were fluid, almost otherworldly, as if water were defying gravity. I couldn't make out their faces, a detail I later realized was a mercy, but I distinctly observed their hands on Hamid's arms, long, pale fingers coiling around his biceps like delicate roots. Above them, suspended in the night like a jagged tear in the sky, was something my mind struggled to comprehend. It looked as though a piece of the heavens had been ripped away, revealing a vast, ominous void behind it. A soft, almost imperceptible hum vibrated in my ears, a sound felt more than heard, like a massive tuning fork's resonance. I should have screamed, I thought. I should have bolted back to the wedding and warned everyone. Instead, I was rooted to the spot, watching as Hamid was led toward that impossible darkness. Just before he disappeared, he turned his head and locked eyes with me. There was no fear in his wide eyes, only something else, an emotion I wouldn't grasp until years later. Then they were gone, swallowed by that tear in the night. The humming peaked briefly and then faded, leaving only the howling wind and the distant clamor of the celebration. I stood there, my feet numb in the snow, waiting, what felt like hours, though probably just minutes, until the guests began noticing his absence. Search parties were quickly organized. My uncle Hassan interrogated me sharply about what I had seen, yet I said nothing of the spectral figures or the sky's rip. Who would have believed a child's fantastical tale? Just as the search parties were about to disperse, Hamid reappeared. He walked back through the door as if nothing had happened. Yet something about him was undeniably off. His clothes remained dry despite the snow. His face bore a subtle sheen as though dusted with frozen fever, and in his hands he held an impossible bouquet. The flowers were unlike anything we'd ever encountered in our mountain village. Delicate petals in shades of pink and white, with deep green leaves that belonged in warmer, distant climes. Not here, not in the dead of winter, not amidst the rugged mountains where even the hardiest flora slumber beneath the snow. "A gift," he announced flatly, "from friends I met on my walk." The celebration resumed, but an inexplicable change had taken hold. When Hamid sang again, his notes lingered too long, his familiar melodies adopting strange foreign rhythms that made some of the older women cross themselves and murmur prayers. I watched him all night. At times, when he believed no one was watching, his hand would drift to the pocket of his coat, where he had tucked one of those otherworldly flowers. His touch on its petals was both reverent and apprehensive. The wedding wound down as guests trudged home through the snow. Hamid declined offers of shelter, insisting he needed to return to his village that same night. No one objected. There was an indefinable quality about him that made everyone uneasy, though no one could pinpoint why. I never saw him again after that night. Rumors abounded that he moved to the city, that he went mad, that one spring morning he vanished into the mountains. In time, his story became yet another folk tale, one told around fires to entertain children and curious visitors. Until last week, when my grandmother passed away quietly in her sleep, she left behind the cedar chest that had always rested at the foot of her bed. As her eldest granddaughter, I was tasked with sorting through its contents: faded photographs, old letters, and unfinished pieces of embroidery. At the very bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, I discovered a dried flower. Its petals, browned by age, still maintained their delicate form, exotic and impossible. Beneath it, inscribed in my grandmother's careful hand on a scrap of paper, were words that made my blood run cold. They promised him China, but I don't believe that's where they took him. The flowers aren't from anywhere on Earth, and sometimes, on winter nights with a full moon, I still hear his music on the wind, though the songs aren't in any language I recognize. I pressed the flower between the pages of my diary, unsure whether it was proof of what truly happened or simply a reminder that some secrets are best left untouched. Perhaps it was both, a testament and a warning. Lately, I've begun hearing that same music on the wind. And just last night, as I gazed out the window, I saw two tall figures in the snow, their long fingers beckoning. Above them, the sky rippled like fabric on the verge of tearing. They're waiting for me, and I fear that this time they will reveal exactly where those mysterious flowers originated. Redditor 2. I've rarely spoken about what occurred during Thanksgiving break in my junior year, not because my memory is hazy, I remember every detail clearly, but because even now I struggle to understand it. Some experiences defy explanation, leaving lingering questions that haunt sleepless nights. It was 2016 when my friend Marcus invited me and our buddy Dave to spend Thanksgiving with his family in eastern Montana. Marcus lived in what he proudly called the middle of nowhere, a small farmhouse surrounded by rolling fields and endless skies. The nearest town was only 20 minutes away, and the closest city was a 3-hour drive, a perfect setting, according to Marcus, for stargazing. Marcus was our resident astronomer. He could name every constellation, track the movement of planets, and pinpoint when the International Space Station would glide overhead. Dave and I, more casual observers, were content to marvel at the clear night sky. But when Marcus proposed we head to Miller's Field after dinner for some serious stargazing, we readily agreed. That night, temperatures had dropped into the low 20s, typical for late November in Montana. We bundled up in heavy coats, scarves, and gloves and set out. The moon was just a sliver, which made the stars appear even more brilliant against the pitch-black sky. The tall grass in Miller's Field whispered around our knees as we walked. "Look, there's Cassiopeia," Marcus said, tracing the unmistakable W shape with his finger, "and over there is the Pleiades cluster." For about an hour, Marcus guided us through the wonders of the cosmos, while Dave and I tried to absorb his explanations. The shooting stars that streaked by were an extra thrill. We counted 6, each one drawing exclamations of excitement. Then Dave noticed something unusual. "Hey, what's that bright object over there?" he asked, pointing to a light hovering just above the horizon. It was larger than any star I'd ever seen, casting a peculiar bluish-white glow that felt off. Marcus frowned and checked his astronomy app. That's odd. There shouldn't be any visible planets in that region right now." We watched as the light began to bob, not moving steadily like a satellite or a plane, but rising and falling as if someone were gently bouncing a lantern. Initially subtle, the motion grew more pronounced until, without warning, the light flickered violently and vanished as abruptly as a candle snuffed out. "Well, that was strange," Dave laughed nervously. "Maybe it was a drone?" We tried to joke about it with our usual UFO quips, but something about that light unsettled us. Perhaps that's why we nearly overlooked the figure sitting in the grass about 50 yards away. I remember it vividly. While Marcus was in the midst of an offhand joke about alien abductions, his flashlight caught a glimpse of pale skin. We all froze. There, in the grass, sat a man with his knees drawn up and arms wrapped around them. He wore nothing but a pair of jeans, no shirt, no shoes, nothing to shield him from the bitter cold. Even from a distance, his body trembled uncontrollably. "Hey," Marcus called out, his voice echoing in the empty field. "Are you okay?" The man turned his head with an almost unnaturally slow motion. Though his face appeared youthful, likely around our age, his eyes were vacant, as if they were empty windows into a forgotten room. "I'm fine," he replied flatly, though visible puffs of his breath betrayed his shivering. We approached him cautiously. Just moments earlier, the field had been utterly empty. There was no sign of anyone moving among the tall grass. Yet here he was, as if he'd emerged from the darkness itself. "You must be freezing," I said, unzipping my coat. "Here, take this." He accepted the coat wordlessly, his skin pale as milk in the beam of Marcus's flashlight. Up close, I noticed strange markings on his shoulders, 3 neat parallel lines on each side, like recently healed incisions. "How did you get here?" Dave asked. The man's eyes flickered between us and then rose to the sky where we'd seen that mysterious light. I don't want to talk about it. I need to go to the hospital." Marcus immediately dialed 911 while we escorted him to a nearby gas station at a highway intersection. Throughout the 20-minute walk, he barely uttered a word except to ask our names and a few oddly specific questions about constellations. When I told him my name, he repeated it slowly, as if trying to commit it to memory. The police and paramedics arrived quickly, but their hushed conversation, snatches of severe hypothermia, unusual markings, temporal disorientation, suggested this was no ordinary case. They wrapped him in thermal blankets and loaded him into the ambulance. As the doors closed, I distinctly recall him looking at me through the window, and for a moment, something in his eyes shifted, like static on an old television screen. I never got my coat back. The next morning, while eating leftover turkey and pumpkin pie, Marcus's family listened with polite skepticism to our story. They speculated that the man might have been on drugs or had wandered off from a nearby farm. Simple explanations for a bizarre occurrence. But later that day, while helping Marcus's mom with the dishes, I overheard her on the phone with someone at the local hospital. They had no record of any hypothermia patient from the previous night. When she contacted the sheriff's office, they too had no record of the incident. I've pondered that night many times since, especially on chilly Thanksgiving evenings when the stars shine a bit brighter. Sometimes I wonder if what we experienced was truly as we perceived it, or if our minds had played tricks on us. Yet I remember clearly those 3 perfect lines on his shoulders, and the way he had seemingly materialized out of nowhere. That unmistakable detail convinced me that what we encountered wasn't entirely human. And on clear nights, as I look up at the stars, I find myself searching for that strange, bobbing light, hoping with every fiber of my being that I never see it again. Redditor 3. I once believed I was adept at distinguishing dreams from reality. That was before the summer when everything began to blur. before I discovered that the line between imagination and truth isn't merely blurred, but utterly erased. It all started during my vacation at Lake Geneva. I had rented a cabin for 2 weeks to focus on finishing my novel, far from the ceaseless rain of Seattle. The first few nights were tranquil, punctuated only by the sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of waves. Then came Thursday. I awoke at precisely 3:17 a.m., the red digits on my alarm clock piercing the darkness. Yet I wasn't fully awake, not in the usual sense. My body felt as though it were made of lead. My limbs refused to obey the rising panic in my chest. The air itself had transformed, becoming thick and charged like the moment right before a lightning strike. That's when I saw them. They emerged, moving through the wall as if it were nothing more than drifting smoke. 3 slender figures with elongated heads and eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. I tried to scream, but my throat was paralyzed. One of them reached out with impossibly long fingers, and in that instant it felt as if my mind was being unraveled, thought by thought. This is just sleep paralysis, I reassured myself. I've read about it. It's natural, scientific. But if it were merely sleep paralysis, why could I smell them? They carried an odd metallic scent, reminiscent of ozone mixed with copper pennies, and why did the air shimmer around them as if heated like asphalt? Then I blacked out. When I came to, sunlight streamed in through the windows and my sheets were soaked in sweat. I spent the morning trying to convince myself it had been nothing more than an extraordinarily vivid nightmare. Yet it happened again and again. Night after night they returned, each visit delving deeper into my mind. During the day, I began to see flashes, fragments of memories that weren't mine, snatches of a vast chamber with floating bodies, the curve of Earth seen from an impossible altitude, the sensation of passing through solid matter as easily as air. I tried every remedy to stop these intrusions, sleeping pills, energy drinks to stave off sleep, even drawing crosses on my walls with permanent marker, much to my landlord's future chagrin. Nothing worked. The worst part wasn't the intrusion itself. It was the mounting suspicion that they weren't merely observing. They were preparing me for something. On the 10th night, I resolved to take a stand. Before bed, I meditated for hours, focusing on a single unyielding thought. This is my mind, my space, my rules. I pictured myself as an unassailable fortress, impervious to intrusion. That night, when they came, I could still feel their oppressive presence, but I fought back. The paralysis threatened to seize me, yet I resisted, imagining my will as a blade slicing through their influence. The tallest figure reached toward me, its long fingers nearly brushing my forehead. In that split second, something in my mind snapped into place, a connection I'd never noticed before. Through it, I sensed their surprise, their uncertainty, their fear. I surged upward, my dream body finally responsive, and in my hand materialized exactly what I'd visualized. A sword of pure thought, gleaming with the light of my own consciousness. It moved faster than I could follow, and the first entity disintegrated into a shower of silver mist. The others recoiled, their enormous eyes widening further. They tried to retreat, to phase back through the wall, but I was faster now, moving with the surreal logic of dreams. My sword swept through the air 2 more times before I found myself alone in the darkness. I awoke naturally the next morning, feeling more rested than I had in weeks. After that night, the visitation ceased. I finished my novel, returned to Seattle, and filed the experience away as a stress-induced hallucination. That worked until 3 years later. Last night, my phone rang at 3:17 a.m. The caller ID was blank. When I answered, there was only static. But hidden within the white noise, I heard words that froze my blood. You taught them fear. Now they're ready to teach it back to you. I'm writing this as I feel the air thickening, charged with electricity. My limbs grow heavy, yet this time I am prepared. The sword of thought still gleams in my mind, as sharp as ever. They wondered if humans could fight back in the dream world. They discovered that we could, but what they failed to realize is that they've given us something far more potent than any weapon. They've given us practice. I can hear them now, moving through the walls. But they aren't the only ones who've evolved. This time, I won't wait to be attacked. I'm going to show them exactly what human nightmares can do. After all, they were the ones who taught me how to move through solid matter. Redditor 4. A deep, low-frequency hum roused me from a deep sleep, a vibration that seemed to pulse through the very walls of my house. Initially, I assumed it was the furnace acting up, but this sound was different. Deeper, almost subsonic, the kind you feel resonating in your bones before your ears even pick it up. The digital clock on my nightstand read 4:13 a.m. Outside, snow fell in thick, languid flakes, lit softly by streetlights. I felt a parched need for water. My throat was dry, likely from running the heat too high. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, my fingers trailing along the wall to steady myself in the dark. In the kitchen, the humming grew louder, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if I were standing inside a giant tuning fork. The water glass on the counter trembled as I filled it, sending tiny concentric ripples dancing across its surface. That's when I noticed the light. It began as a gentle glow through the kitchen window, casting long, eerie shadows on the tiled floor. But it wasn't the warm yellow glow of car headlights or the harsh white of floodlights. This light was bluish silver, reminiscent of liquid mercury in motion. I should have returned to bed, convinced it was all a dream. Instead, I felt an inexplicable pull toward the back door. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the cold struck me like a shock. Though the air was well below freezing, I barely registered the chill. My focus was entirely on what hung in the sky above. There, perfectly circular and about 40 feet in diameter, was an object with a metallic surface that both reflected and emitted light. It hovered silently, and as soon as I stepped outside, the humming abruptly ceased. Snow swirled around it, but never seemed to settle on its surface. Barefoot in the snow, I stood with my breath crystallizing in the air. Time lost all meaning. I could have been there for seconds or hours, my neck craned back, immobilized not by fear, though I was terrified, but by something external. Then it moved. At first, its ascent was slow, a gentle lift that barely stirred the air, but once it reached a certain height, it accelerated with impossible speed, briefly distorting the clouds before vanishing altogether. I staggered back inside, my feet numb from the cold and my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed. Sleep eluded me, but eventually I dozed off and began to dream. In the dream, I was floating amid white walls and blinding lights, surrounded by familiar yet distorted faces, faces that weren't quite human. I sensed long fingers, cold metallic textures, and a pain that wasn't entirely physical. The typical hallmarks of an abduction scenario my mind would have constructed naturally after such an experience. But something was off about this dream. The details were unnervingly precise. I could detect an antiseptic, ozone-like odor. I felt textures beneath me, first cold metal, then something soft and pulsing. Most disturbingly, I sensed the pressure of foreign thoughts pressing against my consciousness, trying to convince me that this wasn't real at all. I awoke the next morning in my bed, sunlight streaming through the window. Everything appeared normal. Perhaps too normal. The snow outside was undisturbed with no footprints. The water glass was back in its usual place in the cupboard, despite my clear recollection of leaving it on the counter. The house was warm, with the familiar hum of the furnace. It has been 3 months since that night. I've nearly convinced myself it was merely a vivid dream, a result of too much late-night TV and an overactive imagination. Almost. Yet sometimes, in the darkest pre-dawn hours, I hear that hum again. This time, it isn't coming from outside, it resonates within my head. And in those moments, I am utterly certain of 3 things. First, what I saw that night was real. Second, what I assumed was a dream wasn't a dream at all. Third, they aren't finished with me. I know this because every morning I discover my water glass in a different spot, sometimes on the counter, sometimes in the sink, sometimes back in the cupboard. And each time, tiny concentric ripples adorn its surface, as if responding to a sound just below the threshold of human hearing. I feel them watching me as I write these words, at the edges of my consciousness, intent on blurring the line between reality and dream. But I know what I saw. I know what they did. And I know they're coming back. The Hume is growing louder. Redditor 5. Aunt Mira spoke of that night in Turkey only once. And that too after 3 glasses of homemade vodka at my cousin's wedding in 2018. I had heard bits and pieces of the story before, whispered in hushed tones among relatives when they thought the children weren't listening. But Mira was there. She witnessed it firsthand. "We don't talk about these things," she said, her weathered hands clutching her glass. "Some memories are better left buried in the past." Yet the alcohol had loosened her tongue, and I sensed this might be my only chance to learn the truth about that fateful summer night in 1994. Our family had fled Ukraine during an economic collapse, scraping together our meager savings to rent a small cottage on the Turkish coast. It was intended as a brief escape, a few weeks of peace before returning to confront the harsh realities back home. The cottage sat on a rocky peninsula, far from any village, so that on clear nights, every star could be seen. "We were lucky to find it," Mira recalled, her accent thick with nostalgia. "It was so cheap because it was off-season, no tourists, no neighbors, just us, the sea, and the dogs. The dogs belonged to the property owner, 3 large Anatolian shepherds that patrolled the grounds at night. They were working dogs, not pets, and usually silent unless alerting us to wolves or jackals. On the 4th night, while Uncle Victor was teaching my young cousins chess, the dogs began barking, not in their usual alert tones, but in a way that was almost like a scream. It was as if they were warning us," Mira whispered. "They sensed something we didn't." There was obviously something there. Uncle Dmitri, the brave former military man who dismissed ghosts and superstition, went to investigate. He stepped onto the small porch, expecting to encounter a wild animal or perhaps an intruder. Instead, he saw lights in the sky. "Not stars," Mira insisted, "not planes. We'd lived near an airbase back home. We knew what planes looked like." This was something entirely different. A massive triangular object, moving silently through the clouds, each of its corners marked by a pulsing light that shifted between colors in a way that hurt the eyes. As it descended toward the cottage, Dmitri shouted for everyone to come outside. "Come see," he bellowed. "Come see what God has sent us." Everyone gathered on the porch, Mira, Victor, their spouses, the children, and even Baba Olena, our grandmother, who repeatedly crossed herself and began praying. The object drew so near that we could see intricate patterns on its surface, like circuits etched into dark metal. The air grew thick and charged with electricity. Static made our hair stand on end. Then the cottage began to shake. "It felt as if the whole house were made of paper," Mira recalled. "Plates tumbled from shelves. Windows rattled. The children cried, but we couldn't hear them over the vibration." The dogs fell silent. For what seemed like 7 long minutes, Mira was sure of the time as she had stared at her watch, unable to look away, the cottage trembled. No one spoke, no one moved. We stood frozen, a family portrait captured in terror, as something beyond our understanding loomed above. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the object ascended straight upward, accelerating impossibly until it vanished into the starry expanse. We spent the remainder of the night huddled together in the living room, too terrified to sleep. In the morning, we found the dogs huddled beneath the porch, whimpering. All 3 had turned completely white, their dark fur inexplicably bleached by some unknown force. The family cut the vacation short and drove back to Ukraine the next day. We never discussed that night with outsiders, and within the family, it was rarely mentioned. Mira explained that some experiences are too immense for words, too strange for the mind to fully absorb. "But why keep it secret?" I asked. "Why not tell people what you saw?" Mira finished her vodka, fixed me with a steady gaze, and said, "Because, child, some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some knowledge changes you forever. We witnessed something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes," she glanced at our family dancing and laughing at the wedding reception, living their ordinary lives, "sometimes I think it saw us too." She never spoke of it again, When she passed away last winter, she took most of the story with her. Yet on clear nights, when I glimpse 3 stars arranged in a triangle, I think of that secluded Turkish cottage, the dogs whose fur turned white, and the secrets families keep to shield themselves from truths too heavy to bear. Redditor 6. Every time I pass through airport security, my right palm tingles where the metal used to be, a phantom sensation the doctors likened to an amputee feeling a missing limb. But amputees don't have security guards who frown as they scan their hands, nor do they have priests question them during communion or spend 20 years wondering whether what happened that night was merely a dream. I was 8 when they came for me, not a dramatic flourish, just the simplest truth. I remember lying in bed, watching shadows from the maple tree dance on my ceiling. My mom was on the night shift at the hospital, and Mrs. Peterson, our regular babysitter, was downstairs watching Late Night with David Letterman. The muffled laughter from the TV filtered up through the heating vent. When I noticed the window slowly opening, I did what I'd honed over the years. I played dead. It was my little superpower, the skill of convincing adults I was sound asleep. A trick that had helped me skip Sunday school countless times and earned me many rides from the car to my bed. I kept my breathing steady, my eyes closed, relaxed as always. Then I felt it, hands lifting me. They were too long and too cold, and I expected to hear Mrs. Peterson's scolding voice for faking sleep. Instead, there was only silence and the sensation of being lifted, not like being carried up a staircase, but as if I were in an elevator without walls, floor, or ceiling, just ascending into the night. Even at 8, my rational mind insisted this must be a dream. I had flown in dreams before, but never one that smelled of ozone and copper pennies, never one that made my skin tingle with the charge of static. It just didn't feel like any dream I'd had. I kept my eyes shut until the motion ceased. When I finally opened them, I found myself in a space my young mind struggled to comprehend. The walls seemed to breathe, bathed in a reddish light that came from everywhere and nowhere. And then there were the figures. For 20 years, I've tried to recall their features, but my mind skips over them as if it were a scratched record. Yet I remember their hands vividly. I recall a sharp pinch on my left hand, brief but intense, then another on my right palm, like icy water streaming beneath my skin, and then nothing. I awoke in my bed with tears streaming down my face and ran downstairs to Mrs. Peterson, who held me as I sobbed. "It's just a nightmare," she said, stroking my hair. "Everyone has bad dreams. But bad dreams don't leave scars." The mark on my left hand resembled a perfect circle, smaller than a dime, raised and pink like a fresh burn. However, it was the right palm that haunted me. Just beneath the surface, something moved, a small metallic object about the size of a ball bearing, shifting ever so slightly when I clenched my fist. For the next 5 years, I underwent a parade of doctor visits, x-rays, MRIs, which I couldn't complete because the metal reacted too strongly, biopsies of the surrounding skin, all revealing nothing out of the ordinary, except for that inexplicable metallic inclusion. It seemed to have a mind of its own, heating up near power lines, cooling down in churches. Every time I passed a metal detector at an airport, it would go haywire. Sometimes, the skin around it would bubble into perfect geometric patterns before settling back. And once, during a thunderstorm, it even glowed faintly blue. I never had it removed, partly due to my childhood fear of anesthesia, but mostly because I grew to like it. It made me feel unique, different, a permanent reminder that something extraordinary had happened, even if I couldn't fully remember or explain it. Then, 5 years, 2 months, and 17 days after that night, I woke to find a small, perfectly spherical ball bearing on my pillow. The metal had simply detached from my skin, leaving behind a small gray mark reminiscent of a tattoo. Under a microscope, it showed no sign of wear or corrosion, seamless, incredibly smooth, completely inert. I kept it in a small box on my dresser for years until one day it vanished without a trace. No signs of tampering, no forced entry. It was as if it had never existed. Yet the scars remained. The circular mark on my left hand faded to a thin white ring, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The gray mark on my right palm never changed. a precise map of where that mysterious metal had resided for 5 years. I'm now 38, have a family, a career, a seemingly normal life, but sometimes late at night I find myself staring at my palm, recalling the weight of that foreign object beneath my skin, wondering what it was recording, transmitting, or waiting for. And sometimes, just as I'm about to sleep, I swear I feel my window begin to open. Redditor 7. I first sensed something was wrong with my brother Marcus during one of our weekly video calls. It was late October, and as the sun had already set in Portland, my apartment was bathed in the cool blue glow of my laptop screen. Marcus looked more exhausted than usual, more than one would expect from an ER nurse working night shifts. "Remember when we used to go camping with Dad?" he suddenly interjected during my story about my latest photography project. There was an urgency in his voice that was hard to ignore. "Of course," I replied, "those trips to Mount Hood every summer." "No, Sarah, the other camping trips. The ones when the sky turned green." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Marcus leaned closer to the webcam until his face nearly filled the screen. "I've been recalling things, memories that just don't make sense, but I know they happened. Like those nights when we were kids, and the camping trips weren't really what we thought they were." "Marcus, you're not making sense. Are you okay?" I pleaded. He ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit from childhood. "I thought I was losing it at first. I started having these dreams about 3 months ago, but they're not just dreams, they're memories. They come back in fragments, like someone is uploading corrupted files into my brain." I wanted to dismiss his words as stress-induced rambling, yet something in his voice made me pause and recall the mysterious gaps in my own childhood, a loss of memory I'd always attributed to time's natural erosion. "Tell me," I urged. They looked almost human, but not quite. Beige, not gray like everyone says. "And there was this room where the walls seemed to see right through you." His voice dropped to a hushed whisper. "They're coming back, Sarah, soon." They told me, though I wasn't supposed to remember. That was the last time I spoke to Marcus. The next morning, his apartment was empty. No sign of struggle, no note, just his phone left on the kitchen counter, open to a note he'd been writing. "The memories are bleeding through. They're not supposed to, but they are. I think it's happening to others too. We need to..." That was 2 months ago. Since then, I've been piecing together the truth, finding others like Marcus who've started to remember and even vanish. The authorities merely file missing persons reports, offering sympathetic nods without seeing the pattern. They choose not to acknowledge it. But I see it. I've been documenting everything, encrypting files, sending copies to secure servers. This isn't just my story or Marcus's. It's happening everywhere. People are remembering and people are disappearing. The ones who speak too much go first. The ones who ask too many questions are next. Yesterday, I remembered something else, a new detail from that room with the living walls. A future that hasn't yet happened, but will. Cities devoid of people, buildings with walls that watch, a vast archive of human experience collected memory by memory. I now understand why they choose children, why they take us up every few years to harvest our experiences, our emotions, our memories. We aren't test subjects or specimens. We are their entertainment, their art gallery, their living museum. Now, as the sun sets, I can hear that music again, a faint bluegrass tune drifting through the thin walls of a motel. 13 strings playing impossible melodies. They're drawing nearer. But before you start remembering too, heed this warning. When the memories begin to flood back, when you start questioning everything you thought you knew, stay silent, stay hidden. Don't let them know you remember. Don't let them know you understand. And if you ever hear bluegrass music in a place it shouldn't be, if you catch sight of beige shapes at the edge of your vision, or if you find yourself humming songs that make your teeth vibrate, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, because they will always find you. Memories once shared no longer belong solely to us. They never did. Redditor 8. I never intended to fall in love with the stars, Yet sometimes the universe unfolds in ways that force you to question everything you thought you knew about reality, connection, and even love. It began 2 years ago on an ordinary August night in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I was walking my dog Max, a 13-year-old golden retriever who had been with me through divorce, job changes, and the loneliness of living in a small coastal town where everyone knows your name but not your story. The night was clear, a late summer evening when the humidity had finally given way and the air felt clean enough to drink. Living along the Atlantic has its perks, especially when it comes to stargazing. Away from Boston's light pollution, the stars put on a magnificent display that explains why ancient cultures built entire mythologies around them. I stopped at my usual spot, a small clearing overlooking the bay where the old Ferguson house once stood before the storm of '98 took it down. Max, ever faithful, began his routine of sniffing every blade of grass as I fumbled with my cigarettes, a habit I'd been trying to kick for ages. Then, in a brief moment as my lighter's flame fought off the darkness, everything changed. Had I looked up 2 seconds earlier or later, I might have missed them. But by a strange cosmic coincidence, I raised my eyes at exactly the right moment. At first, I thought they were satellites, those tiny moving dots I'd seen countless times, following predictable orbits. But these were different. 2 faint objects, barely visible against the backdrop of stars, moved in ways that defied my understanding of orbital mechanics. They danced. That's the only word to describe it. Unlike satellites or space debris that follow straight paths dictated by gravity, these objects wove intricate patterns across the sky like figure skaters on an invisible rink. They drifted apart, then converged in what seemed like a courtship ritual. At times, they hovered motionless, as if contemplating their next move. I remember dropping my cigarette, unlit, watching it descend slowly as I stared transfixed at this celestial ballet. Even Max seemed to pause, his head tilted skyward in an expression of unusual attention. What happened next is where the mystery deepens. My memory of that night contains gaps, a blank stretch between witnessing those lights and waking up in my bed the next morning. Oddly, I wasn't frightened, not then and not now. Instead, I felt a deep wonder, reminiscent of the pure awe I experienced as a child during my first meteor shower. More than that, I felt a profound connection, as if whatever I was witnessing was meant just for me. That feeling only grew stronger over the days and weeks that followed. I found myself drawn back to that clearing night after night, sometimes with Max, sometimes alone once he was too tired for long walks. Though the lights never appeared again, something within me had irrevocably changed. I began noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The way the tide seemed to converse with the moon, the patterns of migrating birds carrying silent messages, and even the wind's whisper, as if it spoke in a language just beyond human grasp. When Max passed away that winter, I buried him beneath his favorite maple tree in our backyard. That night, I distinctly remember the stars shining brighter than ever, as though acknowledging his departure. I sat outside for hours, cigarette after cigarette, lost in remembrance. Then the dreams began. They weren't nightmares at all, but vivid visions. I dreamed of vast spaces between stars and journeys so immense that human lifespans seemed negligible. I dreamed of beings who experienced time so differently that our brief lives were both fleeting and eternal. They didn't just show themselves, they conveyed deep emotions and insights. I learned that love isn't confined to Earth. It exists everywhere, manifesting in forms beyond our comprehension. The lights I saw weren't spaceships or probes. They were messages, postcards from across the cosmos declaring, "You are not alone. We feel, we love." For months, these dreams continued. Sometimes they were brilliantly vivid, filled with surreal colors and geometric patterns that made sense only in the realm of sleep, then vanished upon waking. Other times, they left only a lingering sense of peace and understanding. I began a dream journal, desperate to capture every detail before it faded. The pages filled with sketches of swirling galaxies, descriptions of indescribable emotions, and attempts to explain concepts beyond human language. One entry from last March remains etched in my mind. "They showed me love tonight. Not just human love, though that was part of it. They showed me how love looks from outside time, how it connects all that has ever been and will ever be. The lights weren't dancing, they were expressing something as fundamental as a kiss or a gentle touch. Soon, people in town noticed changes in me. The heavy melancholy that followed my divorce began to lift. I quit smoking almost without effort. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter, channeling this newfound understanding into something tangible. Sarah at the coffee shop remarked that I seemed lighter somehow. Old Mr. Peterson, who had known me since childhood, said I reminded him of his wife before she passed, someone who carried a secret beauty and wisdom. I tried sharing what I'd experienced with a few friends. Most responded with polite nods and worried looks, quickly changing the subject. My sister even suggested I see a therapist, claiming it was grief manifesting unusually. Maybe they're right. Perhaps that night shattered something within me. Or maybe I was reconstructing a simple event into something deeper to cope with loss and loneliness. I've wondered about this countless times. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. Whether those lights were extraterrestrial beings expressing cosmic love, or merely satellites catching sunlight in an extraordinary way, the impact was real. The connection I felt, the overwhelming understanding that love transcends our limited human experience, changed me irrevocably. I still visit that clearing on the clearest nights. Though the ache of Max's absence remains, I sometimes feel his presence in the swaying grass or the twinkling stars. I no longer smoke, but I bring a thermos of coffee and sit for hours, gazing upward. The lights haven't returned in any visible form, but sometimes, between sleep and wakefulness, I sense them. They're out there, dancing their eternal dance of love and connection, reminding us that we are part of something far greater. Just last week, I met a woman at the animal shelter, a newcomer looking to adopt a dog. As we wandered among the kennels, our conversation drifted to the night sky and inexplicable experiences. She recounted a night in Arizona when she too saw something she couldn't explain, and I saw that same look of wonder in her eyes. We're meeting for coffee next weekend. I'm not sure what will come of it, but for the first time since that August night, I feel a genuine human connection intertwined with the cosmic insight I received from those mysterious lights. Because that's the true message they imparted. Love isn't just a chemical reaction or an emotion. It's a force as fundamental as gravity, as universal as light. It exists in the spaces between stars and in the quiet intervals between heartbeats. It's in the way Max once leaned against my leg during our walks, in the celestial dance above us, and in the smile of a stranger who understands. I remain a seeker of truth, forever in pursuit of genuine love. And now I understand that truth and love are one. They're both about connection, reaching across the void to touch something beyond our small existence. Those lights taught me that, and even if I never see them again, I'll carry that understanding for the rest of my life. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, I look up at the stars and whisper thank you, and sometimes, in ways I can't quite explain, I feel them whisper back. Redditor 9. I've never fully shared this story because I've always been afraid people would dismiss it as made up. I'm not one to chase conspiracies or obsess over alien abductions, but when I was a kid, I had a front row seat to a family drama revolving around one of the strangest tales I've ever heard. It happened in the late 1970s, when my aunt was married to a highway patrolman named Herbert Sherma. If that name rings any bells, it might be because you've seen it mentioned in UFO literature or a YouTube video. In some circles, he's well known. A man who claimed he not only witnessed a UFO on a desolate highway one night, but was actually taken aboard. Growing up, I heard only fragments of the story. Some relatives whispered it at Thanksgiving, while others dismissed it as the ramblings of a fool. My mother mostly stayed silent, though I'd occasionally see her shaking her head, lost in a distant memory. As a child, I assumed it was just an eerie legend. But as I grew older, I discovered that parts of the story were documented. The missing time, the hypnosis sessions, even official mentions in various abduction accounts. The marriage records confirmed that my aunt was indeed married to Herbert for a few years. Then they divorced, and she never spoke of him again. Over time, I pieced together the narrative from hushed family conversations, details recounted by those who were there or had heard it directly from my aunt. I can't promise every detail is indisputable, but it's what I now believe happened. Herbert had joined the highway patrol in the mid-70s, a serious, upright man who took pride in his uniform and the order it represented. He wasn't the kind of person to spout wild stories about UFOs or little green men. According to my aunt, he was conservative and methodical, devoted to his routine, patrolling the highways at night, watching for speeders, and helping stranded motorists. So when one summer night, just a few months into their marriage, Herbert came home trembling, pale as a sheet and barely able to speak, it shocked the entire family. He told my aunt that something extraordinary had occurred during his patrol. He mumbled about bright lights and a loss of time. She tried to calm him, but his eyes were haunted, filled with a look of otherworldly terror. When she pressed him for details, he could only manage, "I saw something over the road. My watch is off and my radio went silent." The next morning, he filed a report with his superiors, a brief note mentioning a bright light that might have been a downed aircraft. He didn't mention the missing hours. Who would believe him? But in the following weeks, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would wake up at night drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. My aunt found him pacing at 3 a.m, muttering about hands touching me, voices I can't understand. The most disturbing were his nightmares. Visions of a sterile metallic room humming with an electrical buzz that left him shaken. My aunt urged him to see a doctor. Routine tests, blood work, head scans, psychological evaluations came back normal. Herbert was physically sound, albeit stressed, not delusional. Then he dropped his bombshell. He believed he had been taken aboard a craft. He claimed that the bright light on that lonely highway was a UFO, and that some unknown intelligence had extracted him from his patrol car to perform procedures on him. He used the word probed, his eyes darting away as though ashamed. He recalled only flashes, bright instruments, garbled voices not quite in English, and the sensation of floating helplessly. He said they stuck things in him, testing him as though he were nothing more than a lab rat. This revelation shattered my aunt's world. She was terrified and heartbroken, torn between trusting her husband and facing the incomprehensible nature of his account. She urged him to seek help from specialists, perhaps a hypnotherapist experienced in recovering repressed memories. That's when the idea of hypnosis surfaced. Through a local UFO research group, yes, those existed even then, Herbert was introduced to a hypnotherapist known for regressing alleged abduction experiencers. My aunt was skeptical, but Herbert insisted. Under hypnosis, he revealed even more details that deepened the horror of his tale. He described being lifted from his patrol car in a beam of light that immobilized him, the cramped interior of the craft with its low, curved ceilings and beings, not the short, gray figures of later lore, but tall, vaguely humanoid creatures with indistinct features. They had long, spindly fingers and wore suits of a color he couldn't quite name, somewhere between silver and blue. He explained that these beings communicated telepathically, that he was strapped to a cold metallic table that seemed to shift as if alive, and that hidden instruments emerged to prod and test him. Even under hypnosis, his voice trembled with horror as he described how they peered into his mind, sifting through his memories like files in a cabinet. Eventually, Herbert said he was returned to his patrol car parked exactly where he had been before, but his dashboard clock read 3:17 a.m., over 2 hours past when he last remembered. His watch was similarly off, and dispatch logs confirmed he was unaccounted for during that time. When he tried to radio in, the signal crackled with static before snapping back as though a switch had been flipped. Under normal circumstances, one might dismiss his account as a stress-induced hallucination. But the missing time was confirmed by official records. His terror was genuine. He wasn't boastful or exhilarated by the encounter, only devastated. Word spread quickly among his fellow officers. Some mocked him, calling him Martian Man or joking, "Beam me up, Scotty," while others truly worried about his mental state. My aunt struggled under the weight of public scrutiny, desperate for normalcy. Yet her husband's story had thrust them into the heart of UFO controversy. Eventually, the pressure became unbearable. Their marriage unraveled. They separated shortly thereafter. My aunt later confided that in the final days of their union, she would sometimes wake to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window and murmuring about a return. In his dreams, he would still be aboard that craft, hearing those incomprehensible whispers and feeling that cold, shifting table. She tried to comfort him, but it was as if he'd been marked by an experience beyond human understanding. After their divorce, Herbert disappeared from our lives. My aunt eventually remarried a man who cared nothing for UFOs or the paranormal, and she never again mentioned Herbert or his abduction. When I was a teenager, I discovered an old newspaper clipping at my grandmother's house, a short article referring to a California Highway Patrol officer's strange encounter. The partially visible name Herbert S. confirmed it was him, and my curiosity was irrevocably piqued. I spent time in libraries, this was before the internet became ubiquitous, and uncovered further references to his case, learning how widely his story had circulated in UFO circles despite our family's attempts to bury it. Now, as an adult, I occasionally browse UFO forums or search for Herbert Sherma abduction. Sure enough, there are mentions of him in older documents, and even a grainy YouTube video surfaces showing him, older and visibly haunted, recounting his ordeal in a trembling voice. The snippet, taken from an ADSEA documentary, shows him wiping sweat from his brow, eyes rimmed in red. He mumbled something like, "I wish I'd never pulled over. I wish I'd just kept driving." When people ask if I believe in UFOs, I'm never sure how to answer. I'm not eager to embrace every conspiracy theory, yet I cannot dismiss Herbert's account either. The missing time is a fact. The details he revealed under hypnosis match patterns seen in other abduction reports. Beings, brilliant lights, telepathic communication, invasive procedures, and yet he never seemed to benefit from the encounter. It only cost him his marriage, his peace of mind, and likely his credibility among colleagues. One detail that has always lingered is something my aunt mentioned only once, after a couple of glasses of wine, long after the divorce. She said Herbert developed a small scar behind his ear that he swore hadn't been there before that night. When urged to have it examined, the doctor dismissed it as a minor skin tag or old wound. But Herbert insisted it was new, and my aunt described it as giving her an eerie, crawling sensation, as if it were a remnant of an implant from his abduction. There was no concrete proof, but it deepened the unsettling atmosphere. Sometimes I wonder if Herbert was truly singled out by an otherworldly intelligence, or if he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Did these beings choose him because he was alone on a deserted highway? Or was he just unfortunate enough to cross paths with a phenomenon we scarcely understand? The bleak trajectory of his post-abduction life suggests that whatever happened offered no cosmic revelation, only fear, confusion, and heartbreak. Over the years, I've tried to locate Herbert, hoping to speak with him directly. If he's still alive, he's clearly kept himself off the grid. Perhaps he managed to move on, or perhaps he remains haunted by the idea of their return. Whenever I watch that old video clip, I feel a deep sadness, the strain etched on his face, as if the ordeal had shattered his world. He warned others not to dismiss abductees lightly, for some experiences can break a person's spirit, and his raw pain is undeniable. The mainstream may never fully accept his testimony. Skeptics will say he fabricated it for attention or suffered a psychological collapse. Yet those who study UFO claims remain fascinated by the precise details he recalled under hypnosis, details that predate many modern abduction tropes. In many ways, he was an unwilling pioneer, a law enforcement officer who never believed in such things until he was forced to confront an experience that defied all logic. For me, Herbert's story is a reminder that life can be far stranger than we'd ever imagine. I can't say I'm a true believer, but when asked if there's more to existence than our everyday reality, I invariably think of Herbert. The deserted highway, the blinding lights, the inexplicable missing time, the trembling hands and haunted eyes, and the collapse of a marriage under the weight of an unfathomable experience. Part of me wonders what he would say if we could talk today. Would he still stand by every word? Has he found any peace? I may never know for sure. All I have is family lore and that old YouTube video of a deeply troubled man recounting the unthinkable. Sometimes, during late-night drives on lonely highways, I find myself scanning the sky for lights that don't belong, a reflex I can't explain. Because if Herbert's story taught me anything, it's that on these dark roads, we often assume we're alone, that nothing can disturb our routine, but maybe, just maybe, there's something out there, watching and waiting. And if it chooses you, all our careful logic and order will crumble before whatever lurks in that cold star-studded sky.